Now let's mosey over to Helen Dale and see what's going on in her world. Helen, very good morning to you. I can't really move to the European Union conversation before asking you about what's going on in Scotland, because you were there only recently, and you'll know
Well, I'm
from
very glad. I'm very glad I'm not in Scotland
yes,
now. I have to say, I got my week in Edinburgh and caught up with all but two of my Scottish friends, including in pubs
mm,
and restaurants over a glass of wine
yeah,
uh, before this happened. And I mean, I am aware because of the sort of overwhelming polarisation around the issue of independence
mm,
in Scotland that the SNP was, while I was there, and even when I lived and worked in Scotland going back a few years ago, that the SNP was very popular. Uh, this is the first time I've seen from Scottish people across the spectrum, whether they support independence or they support the union, doesn't really matter, are just absolutely furious about this
I know.
because it seemed to be an assault on Scottishness, basically. And it's also, a couple of my Scottish friends made the point that the SNP spent decades trying to win over Labour and voters in the Central Belt
Mm.
and in Glasgow. And if there is anything that is designed to flush away that support, which is in historical context is relatively recent, if there's anything that's going to flush away that support for the SNP, this is the kind of thing that will do it, because of the centrality of, and I'm not talking, all the stereotypes of, I mean, Scotland attempts to headbutt COVID, which is the joke that I made yesterday, and that kind of thing. But I mean, this is a society that has contributed quite a lot to the development and the refinement of alcoholic
Yeah.
beverages. And to be told that they can't drink them, it's just
Well, I mean,
madness.
I'm Scottish, effectively. Both my parents are from Glasgow, and I know three things that the Scots like: one, drinking; two, dancing; and three, singing. Now, that is not in any way stereotyping them, because all of the Scots that I know how to party. They like a party. But now you go to a pub, and not only can you not get an alcoholic drink, but you can't listen to any music in case it gets you into such a state that you might start singing and spreading the virus. I mean, it beggars
Or
belief.
walking 500 miles.
Well, indeed,
I mean,
indeed.
it's
Well, you
just
can do that as long as
ridiculous.
you don't shout or sing or dance or indeed drink.
They'll be banning the wearing of kilts next.
I know it is, but
I'm
it is,
waiting,
but it
wait
is. I mean,
for it.
but it is interesting, isn't it? That you're quite right to say what you said about the SNP, because the mask is definitely slipping. If you pardon that particular use of the word mask, Nicola Sturgeon, who was only a few years ago being painted as one of the great sort of political leaders of the modern age, has now turned into this kind of crazed authoritarian who can't get enough of telling people what to do.
It is a really striking transformation. I mean, I lived in Scotland until two-thirds of the way through 2014,
Mm,
and I actually worked for a part of that time at the office of the Solicitor to the Scottish Parliament. And this was when Alex Salmond was First Minister.
yeah.
And the idea, and whether you agreed or disagreed with independence, this was irrelevant. But the idea that this is what the SNP would turn into,
Mm,
I mean, I could have guessed lots of other things that they might do, like spending all the money, thinking there's a money tree under Holyrood House and all of this kind of thing. I would have made jokes about things like that in 2014. If they'd won the independence vote, I'd have said things like, well, they're not going to be able to afford to be a social democracy because the EU doesn't want to tartan Greece,
mm.
all of that kind of thing. I would not have pegged the SNP to be an authoritarian party. And to give you an idea of this, because I started out as a practitioner in Australia and worked for many years there, and I'm going to dob him in because I knew him quite well at the time, and he's now a minister, Ben Macpherson,
Mm.
MSP, who I studied with at the University of Edinburgh when I did my Scots Law conversion course. He was the one who pointed out to me, when he travelled to Australia, how alarming he found the Australian tendency of constantly putting signs up everywhere
Mm.
outside pubs or on beaches
Right.
and telling you what to do. Now, he noticed that as a tourist, a Scottish tourist in Australia, and he was alert to it. He was alert to the civil liberties implications in quite a sensitive way. And now the SNP has turned into this. I just don't recognise it. It's just,
no.
I wonder how much of it is just Nicola Sturgeon.
Yeah, well, this is the funny thing. I mean, a lot of people, I think, mistakenly and maybe deliberately have misunderstood the SNP and categorised them as a left-wing party, which they've never really been. They're far more to the right than most people in this country certainly know about.
They used to be called the Tartan Tories.
Yeah, that's right.
People
exactly.
used to joke about them being called. I remember having that joke told to me as recently as 2012 or 13. Oh, the SNP, the Tartan Tories. Eventually, that bedrock of populist nationalism and the authoritarianism that goes with it will come to the surface. And I poo-pooed it, I have to say, at the time. I was wrong, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting. But the whole signage thing is bothering me as well, because I'm seeing a lot more signs, generally speaking. It's starting to happen
here now. It's very Australian.
I mean, I found it incredible. I was saying this to somebody on the show last week, I think. I came in one day on the tube and I was coming up the escalator like London Bridge, and everybody's wearing a mask, nobody's talking, nobody's communicating with one another, and there's all these signs on the escalator that say, be kind. And you're kind of going, all right.
How?
What do you want me to do? And what are you going to arrest me if I'm not kind? And what is the framework for kindness? And at which level of kindness do you want me to go? Am I allowed to go up to somebody to be kind to them? Should I stand back from them, find 1 meter to be kind to them? I mean, it's nonsense, isn't it?
Yes. Well, yes, and it is just this. I mean, and before we move on to Vernon Bogdanor's book, my approach to this has always been to stick to my knitting and talk about civil liberties and recommend other lawyers who are running judicial reviews to talk about this issue in the context of the rule of law and civil liberties. And I'm really quite alarmed at the extent to which the independent heritage of two great nations in this context, because Scotland's contribution goes back before the Acts of Union, the independent heritage of two great nations, England and Scotland, and their contribution to thinking about liberty and liberty itself as a value is just being trashed.
It really is.
That I find that really alarming.
Yeah.
And it's by governments of all stripes. And I'm not exempting Labour from this, because it took a very long time for Keir Starmer to start to query that 10 p.m. curfew.
Well, he's only just now done it, hasn't he?
Even though we know that it has no science, and that the rumour on the Bush Telegraph is that it was introduced, and this is the rumour that I've heard, that it was introduced because Rishi Sunak would not wear a 2-week lockdown.
Yeah.
He was going to do a Sajid Javid and walk.
Robert Jenrick asked today whether there is any medical evidence for it, said that it was commonsensical, which I presume to take as an answer, which means no, there is no medical evidence for it whatsoever.
No.
Exactly.
I mean...
Well, anyway, listen.
Yes.
So let's talk about this fascinating book that you've been looking at and writing about, Vernon Bogdanor, as you say. And the great question, which I'd never thought about really, but an interesting one to pose: what if we'd never joined the European Union?
Well, the book is called Britain and Europe in a Troubled World. And for those of you watching on YouTube, it's got a very clever cover of collapsing teacups, which I quite like. And it's written by Vernon Bogdanor. And I should disclose an interest here. He was one of my teachers when I did my law degree at Oxford.
Okay.
And he was also, and he's been unfortunately pilloried for this a bit, he was also one of David Cameron's teachers at the same college at Oxford.
Well, you obviously got more out of him than Cameron did. That's all I can say.
Well, he was always this extraordinarily capable and striking lecturer. And one of the things he could do, and this is what he does in Britain and Europe in a Troubled World, and I've written a piece on it for CapX, which you've retweeted so that talkRADIO's people who are interested can have a read of it, is that he's very good at putting the other fellow's point of view. Now, there's a genre of science fiction, and it's one of the areas of science fiction in which, the area of science fiction in which I write, known as speculative fiction or alternative history. And basically, the logic of speculative fiction or alternative history is to ask, what if a certain thing had happened differently?
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I've done it with Kingdom of the Wicked. That's book 1 of Kingdom of the Wicked, which asks what would have happened if the Romans had an industrial revolution. They very nearly did.
Right.
There's a lot of good historical evidence for that. But of course, in order to do that, to talk about and write about in a fictionalized way, you have to be very good at understanding the perspective that lost. So therefore, if you're talking about the 1975 European Union, or as it was, European Community or Common Market referendum, what you have to do is imaginatively understand in a very deep and penetrating way what it was for the side that lost. So the people who were in favor of using machines rather than slaves in ancient Rome, I had to have a very good understanding of their perspective. What Vernon Bogdanor has done in this book, now he's a proper scholar, and the thing is, this was a trick. Speculative fiction and alternative history was a trick that was developed by novelists, by people like me. And then actual proper historians, led by the likes of Niall Ferguson, said, actually, real historians and political scientists can use that too. And he kind of led a movement to make it popular.
Right.
And what Vernon Bogdanor has done in this book is put the case so clearly and thoroughly for the no or the outside, not only in 1975, and this is what makes the book really interesting, and it forced me to change my opinion of Charles de Gaulle, basically.
Yes.
My historical view
Who
of
was
Charles de Gaulle.
who was not at all keen on Britain joining, was he?
Well, you see, and he's always portrayed over here, those two and the two vetoes, he's always portrayed as kind of churlish and petty, and that's what I thought, because of the way he'd been selectively represented. So what Bogdanor does is he not only gives you the arguments that happened around when Ted Heath was Prime Minister, or when Macmillan was Prime Minister, or when Wilson wanted to join at various times, he also gives you de Gaulle's reasons for saying no. And they were pretty good reasons.
Well, it was all about agriculture, wasn't it, as it turns out?
It was. It turns out that a huge amount of this was about agriculture. And Bogdanor's understanding of agricultural policy, which tends to be something that Australians and New Zealanders get obsessed with because of the power of our economies with agriculture, is he not only understands all the French and German reasoning for the reasons why they supported the Common Agricultural Policy, but how bad it was for Britain. And the thing is, de Gaulle knew it was going to be bad for Britain because it wasn't designed with Britain in mind. It was designed for European countries that had large numbers of peasant farmers who, if they got indebted between the wars, and it's a pretty horrible story, if they got indebted between the wars, if they had a bad year, their response tended to be to blame the people who'd lent them money, who were often Jews, so you can see where that led. And also, as a corollary of blaming Jews and getting into anti-Semitism, they would support fascist parties.
Right. And also, they had large portions of the economy reliant upon on agriculture, rather. So 12.5% in Germany, 25% in Italy, 20% in France, whereas in Britain it was only 3.6% of GDP.
This is exactly right. And of course, what Britain was doing now, cheap food had been a part of British society since the repeal of the Corn Laws, which, as we all know, split the Tory party. So agriculture is kind of a big deal in context. But what that meant was, because of first the Empire, then the Commonwealth, and the fact that the Commonwealth, large parts of the Commonwealth, initially Australia, New Zealand and Canada, later joined by South Africa, particularly with wine, and the West Indies with fruit and things like plantain and so on, the distinctive foods of the West Indies. Basically, because of the might of the Commonwealth in agriculture, it was just so easy for Britain to keep its cheap food by importing it all from the Commonwealth. And basically, there was this system of what was known as deficiency payments, where effectively British farmers were being paid to manicure the countryside and make it look nice.
And also, they point out, do they not, or de Gaulle's people and those who would agree with him, point out that Britain was a very different type of country as well.
Yes, it was.
From the other sort of mainland European nations, which were not seafaring. I mean, they use the word seafaring as if that's some kind of a weird thing. But obviously to us, it's not at all weird.
Well, no, de Gaulle made this point. He actually made the same point as Churchill. He just phrased it differently about if Britain is given a choice between the continent and the open sea, it must always choose the open sea. Now, de Gaulle didn't make a nationalistic point because obviously he was a Frenchman, so he was nationalistic about France. But he did say you are insular in the old sense of an island, not insular as in with your head up your bum.
Yeah.
You're insular, you're maritime, you have no agriculture, you do commercial and industrial things. Your society is completely different.
And also Britons at that time, and I remember the 70s reasonably well, I was a teenager for most of it, were not particularly considered to be European. You know, we used to go to Europe on holiday, but we considered Europe to be sort of a foreign place.
Yes, yeah, de Gaulle talked about this as well. Geographically, obviously, continent of Europe.
Yeah.
Both the United Kingdom and Ireland fall into the continent of Europe. But culturally, de Gaulle was the one who was pointing out that your country is just completely different. Why do you want to join this club?
Yeah.
And of course, the reason for wanting to join this club was that it was a nice, rich club. It was doing very well. But Bogdanor makes the point. The irony, of course, is that Britain joined in 1973, where it stopped being such a rich club. No blame attaching to the European Union on this or to the community as it then was. It was not their fault at all. It was simply because 1973 was the year of the Arab oil crisis.
Yeah, right. Absolutely
and everybody's economy went into reverse.
And also, you know, the troubled sort of nature of Britain's membership of the EU is entirely a tale of woe, which goes all the way through the expansion of the EU and why it changed its nature. And the EU, as it was that we joined, the European Economic Community that we joined, didn't look anything like the way it does now in 1973.
This is another point that Bogdanor makes, and quoting de Gaulle as well, but he also provides lots and lots of evidence to back up de Gaulle's comments about how the Benelux countries and Germany and France had a lot in common. And if you could overcome German nationalism, which was why Monet and Schumann and people wanted to come up with the European coal and steel community, if you could come up with a way of dealing with German nationalism and stop them rearming, basically. So it was a peace plan. Then they actually economically had quite a lot in common with those neighbouring countries. But the problem was, of course, is every time you expanded the European Union, what became the European Union, to include other countries, the Mediterranean, going east, including the UK, you were including countries that were more and more different from the original ones that under the Treaty of Rome that joined this club. And it became very difficult to, and has become very difficult to administer. And the other thing that has happened is because the economies are not the same, basically they're not the same style of economic production and development, they don't have the same sectors and so on and so forth. You've now got this situation where the old system, where those countries agreed that they had to have a supranational authority to keep the Germans in their box, those rules no longer apply and they just become anti-democratic instead, so that if instead of just keeping Germany in its box, it becomes a vehicle to keep the electorate of large numbers of countries across the EU in their box. And Macron admitted, and he's very good on French politics, Vernon Bogdanor is, he really knows the French political stuff. Macron actually admitted in 2017, I would not want to hold a referendum phrased similarly to either the one in 1975 or the one in 2016 in France, because I think that Leave would win.
No, quite exactly right. Now we haven't got a great deal of time left, Helen. So I'm going to have to ask you the age-old $64,000 question: if we hadn't joined the European Union, would we have been better off?
I think differently off. I'm not going to say better off, but I think the country would have been quite different, and political debates would have been quite different in this country. This is something I'm writing about now, in part because I write speculative fiction. You know, what would have happened if we'd have voted no in 1975? I'm interested in writing about this. I think there's a novel in there.
I think there is. I think it's one for us to continue on, because unbelievably we've already used up all our time. But listen, Helen, thank you very much indeed. We'll come back to that. Imagine what this country would have been like and where we would have been led and who would have led us had we not joined the European Union back in 1973? It's quite a fascinating question, that. This is, of course, Talk Radio.